Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to get started sculpting things and moving things around. So before we get started, I'm just going to give a quick word on pen tablets. Now, while pen tablets aren't a necessity to sculpt in ZBrush and to make amazing things, it does come in handy, and I'll show you why just really quick. So here I am using a pen tablet, and I'm putting max pressure, and as I come farther away, I'm applying less and less pressure, and you can see how it dynamically gets smaller as I apply less pressure to the tablet. Now, on the other hand, here we have a mouse, and it's just going to pull out one value, and there's not a whole lot of transition between sensitivity, as it's a mouse and there's not any sensitivity. So basically saying it's not required to have a pen tablet, but it is handy, and I would recommend anyone who's serious about this to get one immediately. They're not that expensive, and you should just go for it. Okay, so if you have something on your screen, we're just going to go up to Preferences, Initialize ZBrush. Then we're going to go to our Lightbox command. Then we're going to bring up our default wax sphere.zpr. Under Project tab, make sure you're not on the Tool tab like we were before. So we're going to double click that. And you can notice we're already in edit mode as the gray bounding box is there and our edit is highlighted. So we're free to move around the scene without accidentally dragging anything out. Okay, so let's just get started. You can notice if you just hover over your model, you have these two red dots. Now these two red dots represent symmetry, basically where we're going to be painting. And you can notice that you paint on one side, just holding down the left mouse button and dragging across your model, that goes on both sides. This could come in real handy if you want to make different changes, but if you want to turn this off for whatever reason, there's a couple ways to do it. The formal way to do it is to come up to our transform, and if you go down to this here, we have activate symmetry. We just turn that off, and you can notice we only have one red dot, and only changes where our immediate brush are being made to the model. Or, alternatively, there is a shortcut key, which is the X key. Just tap X, and you can notice two dots come, one dot come. There we go. So we're just going to leave symmetry on for this example because it's handy. Okay, so let's start modeling stuff here. So we have our symmetry enabled, and we're just going to left mouse click or just start applying pressure on the area we want to start sculpting. Kind of see we're bringing out some geometry here. So we're just going to Control Z that to undo it. So there's not much we can do with just the default settings. So let's talk about how we can change our brush up a little bit. So if we go to the top here, we notice we have these panels: Z add, Z sub, Z intensity, focal shift, and draw size. Now these are the basic things you can do to your brush to kind of change how your brush behaves. So first we're going to talk about is the Z add and the Z sub. So by default, your Z add is enabled. And basically what it's doing is it's applying a positive value to your brush. So it's going to do something in a positive way. In the case of the standard brush, the positive is pulling geometry out. Now, if we click on Z sub, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to apply a negative value, which is pushing the geometry in. And you can kind of see how that behaves there. So we're going to tap Control Z a couple times. Now, let's re-click on Z add. Now, instead of coming up here and clicking between Z add and Z sub, you don't have to do that all the time, and you shouldn't do that. You should hold down the Alt key under Z add. So if we just left mouse click, we can see we're adding geometry. We're pulling it out. If we hold down the Alt key and do the same thing, you can see the Alt key is doing the opposite of what the Z add is, which is pushing in geometry. So that goes for a lot of different brushes in ZBrush. If you just hold down the Alt key, it's going to apply the negative value or the Z sub value of that brush. So let's just Control Z that a couple times. And remember the Alt shortcut key, that's a very important one. So let's move on to Z intensity. Now what is Z intensity? It is the depth modifier value that you apply to your brush. So if we bring down the Z intensity to like 4, you can see we're kind of pulling the geometry out. but it's not really coming very quick. It's subtle. It's not very intense. Bring this all the way up to like 72. You can see the brush is much more intense in the way it pulls out geometry. So that's Z intensity. Let's go on to over to draw size, which does exactly what you expected. Changes the size in which you draw, or your brush size. Now there is a kind of a handy shortcut key that I use for draw size. The bracket keys on your keyboard bring up and then bring down your draw size. I use that quite often. All right, now let's talk about focal shift. Now focal shift is a little hard to wrap your mind around at first, but it basically is going to affect the way your paintbrush is and your fall off of your paintbrush, I guess is the best way to describe it. Okay, let's start that over. So the focal shift slider is basically going to drag. You may have noticed that when you put your brush over the model, you have two red rings, one inner ring and one bigger ring. The focal slider is basically going to take the weight or the amount of geometry you're pulling out closer or farther to the center. So if we bring this up to like 55, it's kind of hard to tell, but most of the pulling out is being done towards the center, and then everything from the center is kind of a fall off effect. Whereas if we bring the focal shift to a negative value, we can see that it pulls much more of the center circle, and it doesn't really pay attention to the spaces in between. So this is something to kind of play around with. Don't go too extreme. Just keep between the, I'd say like the -40 and +40 range. So I'm just going to Control-Z that a couple times, bring back our default sphere. So now let's talk about the brush panel. Now the formal way to open up the brush panel is to come up here to the left, click on brush, and you're presented with this giant menu of brushes. Kind of intimidating at first, but we'll go through each one when the time comes. But I don't want you to use this way. I want you instead to use the shortcut key B. And what that's going to do, it's going to bring up your brush menu wherever your mouse is. You can see as my mouse is up here. It's going to be up here, there, up here, there. Very handy. Now by default, our selected brush is standard, but as you can see from the standard indicator up here, we're just going to hit B, and we're going to look for the move brush. Now remember that ZBrush likes to keep things in alphabetical order, so we're going to look for the M's, and we can see we can find move just about right here. Now our brush has changed. It is, if we left mouse click, you're going to notice it does something entirely different than the standard brush. What the move brush does is it basically, you click a center fold point and then start and hold down your left mouse button, and you can start to drag out the geometry and just get a feel for the way this brush behaves. So this one is used quite frequently, especially when you want to pull out different, like, I guess I'm making some sort of ears. If I want to make ears or something like this, I can just pull out some ears and then maybe decrease my brush size and then kind of angle myself to where I can kind of put a little ear hole in there. So there you go. So yeah, that's the move brush. And now you kind of notice that the move brush kind of makes these really ugly, jaggedy edges. That's going to be our next brush, our smooth brush. Now, if we just go to hit B and look for our smooth brush, you're going to notice something a little odd pops up. So it's going to say, hey, this brush will be selected as sculpting smoothing brush. Press the shift key and click to use it. So the smooth brush isn't a brush you just click B and select, because you're going to get this error message. Instead, you're going to hold down shift, and you're going to notice that now your red rings have turned blue. This activates kind of a secondary brush that hides beneath the brush, is the best way to think about it. And with that, you get your own modifier. So let's just test out smooth, see what it does. And it kind of smooths out the jagged edges. You can also notice that the blue rings change different from what the red rings are. That's because when you hold down shift and activate your smooth brush, you get an entirely different set of modifiers. You can see with our, without holding down shift, just our move brush, we have a Z intensity of about 51. If we hold down shift, that switches all the way up to 100. Now, if you're holding down shift, you can change this value. So let's say we want our smoothing to be about 14. It means it's not going to smooth as dramatically as the default 100 is. So let's just bring that back up to 100 for default. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to bring up our draw size and Z intensity and focal shift and things like that right at our fingertips. Now, sometimes it can be kind of cumbersome to drag your mouse all the way up here to Z intensity and draw size wherever you want to change it. So what I do is if you just hold down the space bar button down, you can notice you're presented with this context menu. Now this is handy because it appears wherever your mouse is on your canvas. And we're also presented with all your, your basic menus. We have our draw size, focal shift, RGB intensity, Z intensity, Z add, Z sub, also some colors and other things that we'll go into. But yeah, so I would get used to just holding down the space bar and bringing up this draw size and Z intensity menu. Okay, there is one quick tip I want to show you that you should be practicing early on and using about the brush menu. So let's just break out the brush menu, hit B. Now let's say I want to go back to my standard brush. I could just think, okay, this is in alphabetical order. Let me go down and find standard, which is right here, but that could be a little slow, especially when you don't really know where everything is. So what I want you to do is I want you, while the brush menu is open, just instead tap S. And what that's going to do, it's going to isolate every brush that begins with the letter S. So we have like select and stitch, and then we can see we have our standard right here. You also notice that there's this little orange letter next to it that says T. Now what that basically means is you don't have to even click on standard. All you have to do is hit the letter T. And then look, we have our standard brush loaded now. Same thing kind of goes if we want to go switch back to our move tool. So let's just tap B. We know move begins with the letter M. We're going to type M, and then our move tool shows up, and we can see that it's a little letter V. So this is a really quick way to switch between brushes, all the basic brushes, especially when you memorize the different keystrokes you have to do. So the keystroke for a standard brush is just hit B, S, T. Then we can quickly bring up our standard. And then for the move, B, M, V. Then we have our move open again. It's a much quicker way than trying to select or find with your mouse, and it's kind of hard to grasp onto at first, but once you memorize everything, it'd be well worth it. So I advise to use that tip and use it well.